All right. Welcome, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to this month's IGRI research presentation, research seminar presentation, if I can get my tongue untangled here. My name is Uta Brady. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Arizona State University, and I'm also IGRI's Associate Director. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that today is officially the last day for you to submit any abstracts for the 2022 virtual IGRI conference. The link to sign up is in the chat. I just posted it there. The conference is going to take place from June 20 to 22 under the theme of advancing the study of institutional dynamics. So we are inviting research presentations that report on any methodological, theoretical, and/or empirical case-specific uses of the institutional grammar to study policy or societal change. Again, I said that the abstracts are due today, although hint, hint, we might be extending the deadline. We'll let you know about that later. What I did want to point out, what's new this year is that we have a graduate student workshop that will be taking place in person at the University of Colorado in Denver. So if you're a grad student thinking about using the institutional grammar or are using the institutional grammar, please feel free to submit an application. We are going to be sponsoring in part student participations in that workshop. And again, the deadline for that is also today, although it might be extended. And that's all I have for announcements today. Saba, Christopher, do you have anything to add to that?
No, nothing. Thank you, Uta. And please do submit your abstracts. We're looking forward to hearing more about all of your work in June.
Yeah. Okay, so without any further ado, let me introduce today's guest speakers. They'll be co-presenting their work. Leading the presentation is Santiago. Santiago, I'm going to mutilate your last name. Do you want to just say your last name? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a hard one. It's Virgüez.
Virgüez, yes. So he's a postdoc, political science PhD student interested in policy reform and comparative judicial politics. He's at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And he's going to be co-presenting today with Charlie, Brenda, Doug. Am I missing somebody? Seth, Charlie and Brenda and Doug, also from the University of Massachusetts and Amherst, and Seth Frey, who hasn't joined us quite yet. He's probably running a little late, and he's at UC Davis. So without any further ado, oh, he is here? So without any further ado, Santiago, please go ahead.
Yeah, so Santiago, we plan, I'm going to give a little introduction. Sorry to interrupt you, Santiago. And then I'll hand it over to Santiago, who's just a fantastic colleague. So just welcome everybody and thanks for being here. Yeah, as Ute just said, this is a kind of a tag team IGRI seminar led by Santiago, but the other collaborators as well. So what we wanted to do was start out with why are we doing this session? And some of you may have heard me say this before, but just imagine some years from now, and I don't know how many years out it is, 10 years, 20 years, but imagine that we have a scenario where we have some kind of software that we've been calling IG extract that can take rich text, digital text as input, and output institutional statements into an IG syntax structured database. Okay, so that's a goal, somewhat of a long-term goal that we want to, as a community, we hope will work toward. A second one is what we've sometimes called IG analytics, which would be a software tool that provides metrics about some institutional design stored in an IG-based database structure. And then the third component is this other analytical tools, such as agent-based models that might use an IG database structure as input. So our goal, and one of the reasons we're doing this seminar, or this discussion today, it's really going to be more of a discussion in some ways, is that we need to move toward a community-based institutional grammar open data standard. And that's what we're trying to hold this discussion today is about. So most of you probably know what that is, but for those who don't know what an open data standard is, one definition is it's agreed upon documentation that help people and organizations to publish, access, share, and use better quality data, in this case, IG-based data. So for our community, our IGRI community, if we establish an IG open data standard or standards, there'll be some benefits to this. One is learning. It'll be easier for people to learn how to use IG. A second thing is reliability. It'll make it easier for us as a community to identify where disputes or conflicts in IG-based coding occurs. The third is reproducibility and replication. So it'll be easier to reproduce and replicate results based on IG coding. And the fourth, kind of linking back to the software vision I laid out in the beginning, is data aggregation. Standardized data will allow us to aggregate data and to train models. We have several people in the community that are working on machine learning, and this data standardization will make it easier to convert coded data for use in automated approaches. Now, those four things, learning, reliability, reproducibility, data aggregation, will make it easier for us as a community to expand the use and the development of IG in the future. So that's really kind of the reason why we wanted to do this session. And with the idea that what we're trying to do is build community norms, I suppose, that with an emphasis and a commitment on openness. So for example, the IG extract software that Doug Rice has been leading, it's going to be open source licensed. So that's my little introduction. But as you all probably saw, we sent out, or Santiago sent out a survey last week to the IGRI community and related to all of this. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Santiago to present what he learned from that survey and then to move us toward a discussion about open data standards. So Santiago, you want to take over?
Sure. Thank you, Charlie. So let me share the screen. So as Charlie mentioned, like the purpose of this survey was trying to understand the experiences people have using IG. As he mentioned, like you can see this open data standards project of, having multiple data sets to train qualifiers for machine coding, these kind of things. But we also want to spread the IG syntax, right? More scholars, more practitioners using the IG syntax in order to analyze institutional statement. And also, and this is a big part of the project, like have the possibility of comparative research, right? Compare across different institutional settings. So again, we wanted to see the experiences behind the use of IG. So a little bit about the background on the knowledge background of the people who took the survey. So as you can see, all of the people have some degree of experience using the IG syntax. Most of them have some prior experience, and we will see that this is connected to the use of IG 1.0, like most of the people use IG 1.0. But at least we know that these people have an idea of the syntax. Of course, that's different than using actually the syntax to analyze the institutional statements. So we have seen tons of work, like theoretical work on the IG syntax, the elements of institutional statements, but we're trying to encourage more like people to apply this kind of theoretical concepts to actually analyze data sets, empirical data to provide insights in this. So again, like the majority of people have used the syntax to specifically identify institutional statement in different documents or interview data. We will see that's an interesting part, but a bunch of people haven't used it practically to analyze this. As you can see, there is a great difference in terms of the documents people have analyzed. So you have the typical law and regulations, because the formal institutions are at least less complex to analyze using the IG syntax. So you see that law and regulation is the most common document analyzed, but it's really interesting how a lot of people have used interview data. And we have seen in some papers and some of the responses that actually one of the problems we identify is connected to this, like how to analyze interview data or common language, non-formal institutions, non-formal rules using the IG syntax. That's one of the challenge. But it is really interesting to see how people have tried to use the IG to analyze this kind of data also. So briefly about the main topics. Again, we have a great variety of topics analyzed using the IG syntax. So ecological restoration, US state nonprofit law. So you can see most of them are regulations, right? Again, as trying to analyze formal institutions with this. Of course, in terms of aquaculture communities, is a really interesting work, like Professor Siriki trying to analyze these regulations, but with interview data. So I will be brief with this. IG 1.0 is the most common syntax used, and we know why. Like IG 2.0, as we will see, adds more complexity to the IG syntax. It's richer, of course, for analysis. You have a more precise and more complete information from institutional statement, but it's also more complex to use. So we still see, like, most of the papers published, most of the research focus on the use of IG 1.0, that it's basically the application syntax, right? Trying to see the attributes, objects, deontics, aims, conditions, and sanctions or else in those institutional statements. But as you can see, we're going to focus on common standards for IG 1.0, but also for 2.0, because like we're encouraging people to move forward to like at least analyze some information from IG 2.0, because that would provide more complex and richer analysis for your study. So the most common difficulties, that was like the main purpose of the survey. So one of the common difficulties people have encountered with using IG is how to code implicit information. So as you may know, like when you take certain regulation, you have sentences with clear institutional statements, and sometimes those institutional statements have, for instance, a clear attribute, right? The actor who's in charge of the action in the institutional statement. But like any written document, sometimes you don't have this implicit information, right? Like the regulation could not repeat the actor in every single sentence, because the document is talking about certain actor. You don't need to repeat that actor in every institutional statement. So for a simple reader, you know that they are talking about this actor when they mention this kind of a statement. So that's what what people says is implicit information. It's information that it's part of the institutional statement, but it's not in the raw text. It's not written in the raw text. So as you can see the example, so a regulation must could talk about how to apply or not to apply synthetic chemicals once organic certification, but not making explicit reference to the actor, in this case, the certified organic farmers. So this is a simple solution when you code the information. It's more challenging for machine coding, of course, because you as a reader could understand what's the implicit information in the text. Is more difficult, not impossible for machine coding. But if you're having troubles with this, like coding, once you know the implicit information, like the common standard that people have used is just square brackets. So again, it's just a simple solution, but that gives like organization this implicit information. So again, if you don't have the specific attribute in this example, you just use a square bracket to say, okay, this statement is talking to certified organic farmers. So again, simple, but it's really important for an open standard. The second most common problem was people don't talk in IG syntax, right? How to analyze interview data or common language, including emails, and trying to extract institution statements from this. And of course, yes, people don't use this formal language, but it's not impossible. I would say that I would recommend the work of Watkins at Westphal. This is People Don't Talk in IG. That's the title of a paper. And again, Professor Siddiqui work on aquaculture communities, how they extracted institutional statements using the syntax from interview data. It's really interesting. And I think most of the focus of the discussion here is if you use softwares as NVivo, that it's common to analyze interview data, versus like using spreadsheets. You know, like everyone is comfortable using whatever software they know more about. I will encourage you, and we all encourage you, to use the spreadsheets, right? And these papers present a good example of how they actually deal with using NVivo versus using the spreadsheets, and how they decided to use the spreadsheet as a more useful way to code IG syntax and institutional statements from non-formal documents and interview data. And the third, and this will be the focus of the discussion, I would say, of course, if you have any question, like we can discuss about the other problems, but it's how to code relational data. And this is connected on how to code like what has been called IG 2.0, right? So I'm gonna explain a little bit about the problem of relational data when you code it on a spreadsheet. Why it's a problem, why do we have these multi-part activation conditions, like what it's called nested structures. Yes, I will talk more about it when we talk about the discussion about the common standards for IG 2.0. So using the information from the survey, and specifically one question about what other information people code besides the applicable components, and comparing differences and similarities between 88 data sets that we received, like from survey and other sources. Like we try to compare and see how people are actually organizing the information in the spreadsheets or using whatever system they have. We try to compare those to come up with a standard, at least for IG 1.0 first. So you can see aquí, this is a collage of some of the examples we received. As you can see, like for IG 1.0, it's really standard, you know. We were glad to see that most of the people use kind of the same structure. The only main difference, as I mentioned, it was written in the previous slide, is that there's a difference in which people organize the article components as columns, while other people do it as rows. The most common one is the article components as columns. And this is like more useful to analyze the information, to have every institutional statement as an observation here, that then you can compare, right? The attribute, the theontics would be elements of factors of that observation, that institutional statement. But again, you see that when talking about IG 1.0, there's not too much difference across the data sets people have used. Sorry. No, it's, yeah. So this is what, based on the comparison, the information we have had. And I would say, Charlie, yes, like we thank people to provide these data sets for the comparisons. We all came up with this, what we propose should be the IG 1.0 standard, and should be because it's more useful for you, and it's useful also for the community to organize information. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. You have the raw institutional statement. You have the applicable components of the institutional statement. Again, because this is IG 1.0, we're not dealing yet with relational data, so nested or conjunctions with this that is more complex. We are going to expand on these in the following discussion. And the other information that is coded besides the applicable elements is the statement type, institution type, regulative, constitutive, based on like Elinor Ostrom work on rules. And that of course will depend, will depend on the research question that you have, of course, like how many columns you will use. So I think I'm gonna share again my screen to provide an example that would be probably more useful.
Santiago, I also wonder if maybe we want to have the discussion about the open standard 1.0 right now and then move into the 2.0. Just looking
sure.
at time.
Yeah, I'm gonna say like, let me just show the.
That makes sense to me to have a discussion here on 1.0 first.
Yeah, let me just share an example and we can build on that example for ID 1.0. I think it's more useful when we use these kind of examples. So this is the proposed standard for ID 1.0. So you have the raw institutional state. So in this case, it's a really simple one. A certifying organic farmer must not apply synthetic chemicals once organic certification is conferred, right? So you go to the attribute. So in this case, it will be certified organic farmers. Again, in IG 2.0, you will identify the what it's the qualifiers of that attribute, that it's farmers that are certified and they are organic farmers, but in IG 1.0, it's not a problem yet. So this would be the attribute. Then you have the objects. So object is the receiver of the action. In this case is because the action, the deontic, well, I'm gonna put it here. So the action would be applied. The deontic must not. And the object of the action is the synthetic chemicals. So again, you can see that it's a straightforward in how to code this. The condition in this case is an activation condition, but again, that's something for ID 2.0, but it's once organic certification is conferred, right? That's the condition when certified organic farmers must not apply the synthetic chemicals. There is not or else. So in this case, it's a norm because have the elements except of or else component. If you have an or else, you will have a rule from a rule. If you don't have a deontic, but you have the other elements, you will have would be different strategy, right? So I think this is like actually it could be automatically coded depending on the spaces you fill in. The institutional type in this case, choice, but again, you have the whole institutional types provided by Elinor Ostrom. This is a regulative statement, and we have an operational level of analysis. So I think this format is simple to use. Again, when you are not dealing with nested or more complex institutions, and provide like a clean way to organize these, and then eventually like provide elements to compare with other data sets. So yeah, I think this is a good time to seek like comments or questions about what it's the ID 1.0 before discussing the ID 2.0.
If I can chime in with a little asset. So this might not seem different from what you all put together, but a really important thing, at least in terms of data, is that it's the same number of columns in. Am I coming through okay? Oh,
You're breaking up a
same
little
number
bit.
of columns in this. Okay, same number of columns in the same order with exactly the same heading. So these little things like an extra space in the name of one of the headings can, analysis
I think with Seth, he's breaking up a
building a
bit.
large pipeline with a lot of data. So real standardization.
Seth, maybe turn off your video, see if that
Yeah.
helps.
And maybe I can just help Seth a bit here. I mean, if we have everybody collecting it in the, just taking that spreadsheet off the IGRI website and filling it out, then we've really got consistency that would help with downstream analysis. And it would also help with coding. You know, I think if you have a team coding, you don't have to go and figure out the spreadsheet. You can just get it from the IGRI website. So part of what we wanted to do was to just have a discussion with people if they, what do they think about creating a standard for 1.0?
I like the part of the standard, but I would suggest moving the object to behind the aim and between the aim and the condition, so that the statement reads more like it's written.
Ute, can you also type that into chat so it's recorded? I guess it was recorded by voice. I can't, I'm not in a situation where I can take notes easily. Looks
No
like
problem.
Claudia.
I'll put it in the chat.
Or Brenda, do you want to, looks like there's some hands up.
Oh, let me,
Claudio, there's
yeah.
Claudio and Saba.
Claudio is top on my screen.
Just a tangential question, and I hope I'm not wasting your time. When we coded rules and regulation of this type exactly, we found a problem with or else in the sense that all rules have or else somewhere in the sanctions part of the regulation. So to say that it doesn't exist, I guess the answer is yes, it doesn't exist in this specific institutional statement. And then we have institutional statements on sanctions, penalties, that are all about the or else. Is that the way to go then? I know it's not what we are exactly discussing tonight, but I saw you were so sure about saying, no, there is no or else, whereas we had doubts at that point of coding.
Saba, does your comment follow on, or should we?
My comment is slightly different, so I think go ahead and please respond to Claudio first at length.
Yes, Santiago, do you want to take that one, or do you want?
Yeah, that's an important, like, it's really important comment what Claudia said, because of course, like, for the sake of the example, I'm using a really simple one in which you don't have an or else. But of course, when you read this kind of regulation, you don't have like a straightforward statement in which applies the or else just after the explanation of the rule. Of course, sometimes they have different sections, different parts, or even different paragraphs. So I would say that you should include the or else for that institution statement here, because otherwise, like, you were coding something as a norm when you know that it's kind of a problem, that it's not a norm, it's a rule, it has a sanction. I would say that IG 2.0 will resolve like tons of problems, like the ontological problems that Franz and Siddiqui mentioned in this paper about like how to properly code these kind of things when it is not necessarily in the same place. But yes, that's absolutely important, and that would be the way to go. If there is a sanction, you will code it in the or else.
Claudio, any follow-up?
No, thank you very much. That's exactly what we did. So I feel reassured. Thanks.
Saba?
Can I just do a follow-up on that?
Sure, go ahead, Charlie.
Because if we're trying to, I think what we're doing, and we want to get to the 2.0 spreadsheet discussion, but if people want to keep with the 1.0, Claudio, you just alluded to how you did it. So do you have any recommendations for the 1.0 spreadsheet on how we would handle that situation?
It looks very similar. As you said, it's pretty standard, and ours was the same. We just had other columns that are not about 1.0, like legal base, and we always thought, what about there's stuff that cannot be coded in 1.0, so extra columns that then they never make sense. It just, in theory, by coding, let's say 1 million rules, then if you find that a column that is not in this syntax, but exists in the population beyond a certain significance level, maybe then you deserve the Nobel Prize. So we always thought about the column that Eleanor and Sue Crawford didn't think about, but we didn't find that, systematic occurrence of other grammatical elements. Again, it's an aside comment.
Okay, so what I'm hearing then from that is that this structure is okay, but limited. And what the researcher really should do is move to the IG 2.0 structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Saba?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't know if my comment is more appropriate now, my first comment is more appropriate now or later, but I guess, insofar as IG 2.0 can be viewed as an extension of IG 1.0, I wonder about the value of having separate, like, standards or separate forms for the two different coding. I mean, so conceivably you could have all of the possible categories that are accommodated under IG 2.0, and that would be inclusive of IG 1.0 coding, but still allow sort of more flexibility, I think, on the part of the coder, because it could be that they want to code at IG1 level, but grab one syntactic annotation from IG 2.0, and having it sort of all captured within one allows the coders to adapt their coding based on their research questions, while at the same time still operating on this worksheet that supports comparability across coding, across coders,
Okay.
across projects,
I think
etc.
that's so.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Seth.
Oh, of course, please. And
That's
if
exactly
I'm
what we
coming
were
through-
debating.
Yeah. And I ended up coming out on the side of two tabs. If I'm not coming through clearly, Brenda, feel free to take over. The reason I ended up coming out in favor of two tabs is that look, for example, at the condition or else columns. So in IG 2.0, those have been broken down into different types of condition, different types of or else. And that means that if I'm an IG 1.0 coder and I'm not focused on or else, I just want, the way those work in IG 1.0 is there's a lot of focus on getting attribute, object, deontic, and name right. And then the condition or else kind of a little bit function as like other categories where you can just get a lot in there. And that's kind of okay if you just want to focus on attribute, object, deontic, or aim. But if you're using the 2.0 template, you're sort of obliged to break condition down into the 2.0 standard, to break or else down along the lines of the 2.0 standard. And so you can't opt out of certain finer grained things. So what I'm kind of thinking as a recommendation for people who want to benefit from an a la carte approach to 2.0, an overall 1.0 approach benefiting from this or that of the 2.0 approach, I would recommend pulling columns in from the 2.0 template into the 1.0 template and kind of rearranging it to suit you for that. But the 1.0, I don't think it's technically a subset of 2.0, but it's not a subset in this sense. The templates, I don't think, are subsets of each other. I'm sorry, the 1.0 template is not a subset of the 2.0 template, even though the 1.0 standard is a subset of the 2.0 standard.
Santiago, why don't you share the 2.0 spreadsheet? So this is what Christopher France and colleagues
And
developed.
I think Seth, what you're saying definitely makes sense to me. I mean, so I see the intuition behind separating them. I still think that there are relatively efficient ways to blend them. I mean, because in the sense, the difference between IG 1.0 and IG core, for example, is a breaking out of the objects and the the context, the conditions, into activation conditions and execution constraints. I mean, conceivably, if you were to do like a combined template, you could just have object and context, or, and then you could have other columns next to them that allow you to break that out further, or keep them concatenated, as Chris and I say, for the purpose of sort of, aggregating the information. So I see what you're saying, Seth, and I guess I still am interested in the possibility of combining those. The other question, it's a suggestion I have, is actually different, and it is applicable if you keep them separate or not. So one thing that Chris and I have now also been working on is like an IG script, a way that one can sort of code statements inline, if you will, like put the syntactic category annotations, like for example, embedded in the statement itself. And I wonder if there's a way to incorporate, have one column that represents those statements according to the IG script. And the reason for that is, Charlie, you had mentioned, and I believe at the beginning of your talk, we want to be thinking about data collection, but we also want to be thinking about data analysis, and having the data represented in different ways can actually, maybe more or less computationally useful. So any case, Chris, please comment on everything as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I think Sava speaks close to heart, certainly. But let me respond a bit more to this debate or question or suggestion that Seth just offered in the discussion. I think to some extent it comes back against to the analytical objectives, of course, but also just the realization that if you encode anything in 2.0, it's backward compatible. We can bring it back to 1.0 and analyze it there. If you code it in 1.0, you need to recode for 2.0. At least you need to reiterate over the data. So there may be analytical opportunities you're missing out on ultimately, because when we collect data sets, we're also thinking about, possible use in other instances. For instance, the organic farming data set that has lent a lot of support and motivation for the construction of the IG 2.0 was certainly preceded the encoding there. And so, that's perhaps the debate to be had in how far people want to be future, proof-ish with respect to their encoding activities or not. I wouldn't be dogmatic about favoring one or the other approach, because you could still engage in recoding. You just need to be consciously doing so. I think that would be the key point there. So if that makes any sense, sorry, please.
I was just wondering if maybe you could talk through the 2.0, because when I saw this for the first time, I had created a different system, and yours is so much superior, and I like the numbered approach that you have. And so Santiago's got your 2.0 spreadsheet up. Could you maybe talk through your idea in terms of the numbering device?
Yeah. Can I share another screen? A slightly different, yeah, thank you. Perhaps that motivates it better. Sarah just talked about how we think in terms, how we think about encoding in the first place. And what you see here on top, first of all, of course, we need to have an example that we encode. And the idea is basically, when we take the coding in the first place, is that we use some sort of syntax to encode it systematically, highly structured. But this where it would be, in IG 2.0, the primary means of encoding. So you would not play around with spreadsheets. And I give you a reason why in a second. So I'm not going to talk about this. We can talk about in another context. We'll probably talk about this in a conference anyway. But the idea, once you have this kind of encoding where you basically take a raw institutional statements, this, for instance, you would encode in this very way. And ultimately, it embeds this whole, multi-condition situation. So CEX means execution constraint. We have another one here. We have activation condition. And we basically quickly see that the statement combinations, IG 2.0 is all about nesting and extracting this fine granular atomic information, would expand it to 4 statements, because we have 2 combinations, right? One on execution constraints, one on activation conditions. And the idea is basically that this would be systematically expanded into 4 atomic statements arising out of 1 statement. And we would basically be able to observe the delta, well, all the possible combinations of the delta, in as far as they pertain to the activation condition, execution constraints respectively, that would then be logically linked, basically, B end is going beyond the point here right now, but basically it says there's an end linkage on an activation condition with, you know, lines or statements 1.3 to 1.4, and conversely for the other ones there's a linkage backwards and so on, and there's a linkage on the execution constraint. So the idea is basically to retain this structure. What Brenda just talked about, you know, so the idea is here, this way is flat. It flattens basically any representation of institutional statements in a flat structure that's uniform. The advantage, it scales inherently. There's no consideration, do we have 2 activation condition or 5 or 25? It doesn't matter. It would be all consistently capturable in this context. What Brenda referred to earlier, saying about, okay, how do we deal with this whole nesting consideration? Especially IG 2.0 is a bit, introduces a bit complexity. If we look at the statement, let me just annotate this a bit, of that kind. So we have a regular statement, responsible actor must act according to provisions without undue delay, 2 execution constraints. Then we have a temporal activation condition and a spatial one. But the last bit here is actually the key, an activation condition that basically of the type of an institutional state type. So basically it describes a set of conditions or a circumstance under which the whole statement applies. And it in itself, again, the nesting concept comes to play. It embeds basically a full institutional statement structure, and this is where it comes to the encoding that looks slightly different. So we have the same statement that I just showed before the earlier one, but in addition, we of course allow nesting, for instance, on activation conditions that can be complex or trivial. This is a simple one, primitive activation condition. This is a complex one, which makes a reference to another statement, and the statement it makes reference to is are those 2 ones actually, right? So and they themselves, however, may have a combinatorial linkage. So we're going back into our logical linkage column and see here how they are logically linked. So the idea basically in IG 2.0 is an inherently structured schema. It also takes into account annotation, as Saba said right now, by baking them into the schema effectively. It also bakes in the constitutive side, and you see that a lot of empty columns, so you're largely ending up with a kind of sparse matrix challenge here, but it basically allows the representation of everything in one line. Is that something you were looking for, Brenda, or did I leave out some detail I should have explored a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I just to get back to Seth's point, and Seth, you have your hand up, so
Go ahead, Brenda.
feel free. Just if I have undergraduate coders and I'm just trying to get them through,
Yeah.
this is really hard.
Yes.
It's going to take a lot of my semester to train those undergraduates. With the 1.0, that's a very simple spreadsheet. And I can at least get the 1.0 pass. So Seth, were you going to say something different than that? Or similar?
Yeah, I was going to make an elaboration of that point, which is that, you know, I think there's no question this is the inline system is superior. This is also a really good system that's equivalent to the inline system. That our system is kind of retrograde, but this system really is right now too complicated. And I know the vision, which is to have tooling that makes it really so anyone can do it. Until then, I'm personally kind of looking, well, what are people using? And they're still using Excel spreadsheets. They're still a lot of times using 1.0 because of its relative simplicity. And that's reasonable, especially if they're going for an a la carte approach. Let's say they're not trying to come up with a computational representation of every institutional statement. Let's say they're just trying to extract all the agents, extract all the deontics. When you look at most actual analyses using IG, that's pretty much it. They focus on what's most usable, which is still pretty usable from 1.0. And so my vision and a little bit of the philosophy of this approach is that let's simultaneously set the goal for where we need to be, and that's everything you're describing, and meet people where they're at today, and that's a little bit the template that we're proposing, and then work to meet in the middle.
If allow me to respond. So Seth, you anticipate, of course, my point. Yes, that is only and can only be feasible by tooling. That's the main point. I mean, the reason why I'm elaborating is basically this is perhaps the analyst's perspective, certainly not the coder's perspective. I don't code in Excel ever. I would not code in a spreadsheet anymore. I'm not sure why one would, but in any case, but no, don't get me wrong, but it will get too complex. There's absolutely no doubt. Very trivial statements really explode quite quickly. Ultimately, the challenge will be to write the suitable analytical facilities that can pass this output. But fundamentally, the solution will be a different one, where you basically, I can just motivate this super briefly where you basically take, input and pass this kind of output, basically, based on this IG script syntax, if that makes any sense. I'm not talking about it in depth right now, but that's something you basically copy paste and then use in downstream analysis effectively. But the input, that's why I was pondering so much about this whole IG script thing, however briefly, it will actually happen in this kind of syntax that people start to learn. Anyway, that's 2 cents to this one. But I appreciate the point. If it's really unnecessarily, or let's say unnecessarily cognitive load, let alone infrastructure that's inherently not needed for a very trivial analysis, along the lines, I'm just interested in attributes and objects, sure, don't bother with this. However, the IG2, in as far as standard is concerned, actually in the codebook describes already how you specify which features you use and don't use, because you don't have to use all features. If you don't care about aims, don't code them. If you don't care about activation conditions, well, it's also not required. So there are some facilities, but I agree, having a from a intuitive approach, I can recognize that an Excel spreadsheet that you directly use can have its appeal. But I think that's a matter of tooling and also our training. That's basically the argument I would put forth here.
So Juniper has a question in the chat. Do you want to ask that, Juniper?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Brenda. I'm just I'm trying to catch up with Chris and understand like how it really works. So I would take an institutional text. Let's say I would OCR it so that it would be recognized as text. Then you would feed it through the code, and the output would be what you were showing us in the spreadsheet. And so in terms of the technical skills that a person using this approach would need to have, what are those technical skills? I mean, are we to a point where someone could use the tools that you all have been developing without understanding all of the, the technical underpinning for what makes it, like, is there a UX for it? Like, how does it work? Yeah.
Yeah. Part of my answer is in the chat. But so basically the idea is you would learn something we would call IG script effectively, basically a different way, not worrying about how it looks in the end. And the outputs can be very different. I only showed a tabular output, but this gives you flexibility to think in all ways, because we have tried it by hand and we have suffered. But using this way would be the way. You would rely on tooling that would be it would include a dependency, of course, in your tool chain. However, this is alleviated in 2 ways. Number one, of course, it would be tooling that's openly provided, so you have the transparency. It's not like using NVivo and don't know what's doing in the backend, even though it's very transparent in that case. Here you would have an open tool. But I don't think with the level of complexity and detail you would be encoding with that you could do it by hand anymore. It's just we need, that would be the next stage. In as far as learning an approach and accessibility goes, it would literally be about us teaching or learning or whatever it would be this IG script syntax, which is hopefully relatively straightforward, has a lot of parentheses, warning. That's it has to, otherwise you can't scope. But a matter of learning this and using the tooling. And admittedly, Juniper, I mean, yes, ideally we want to have a tool that does it as perfect as we would like it to have in a word processor, but this will require a bit of processing over time. I mean, I've developed quite a bit on this in the meantime already, just trying out and have talked or interacted with in particular Angelo on various instances, just to try it out and iterate. And if anyone is keen, let me know. I'm happy to alpha test it more. That's why I'm using alpha, because I don't want to spread it too wide before people start relying on it, because I know how it is. Once people see something works, they use it for research. And this is not a path dependency you want to establish unless you really have a thorough and a solid product. So that's why I'm somewhat hesitant to be utmost forthcoming. But that's something we need to discuss. Perhaps subject to conference or next session. I don't know, whenever you would see fit. I hope this offers you some sort of response to your question, but ultimately it should be simple for you. That's the main point, not more complex. You still get Excel at the end.
Should we let the presenters go back? I worry we've only got a few minutes left. Sergio,
This was supposed to be a generative discussion, so it's exactly
Yeah.
the kind of discussion that we wanted to have. Just
Okay, thank
open up the discussion. And so this is great. Charlie, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say, I know we've only got 5 minutes. You know, Christopher, I really appreciate what you just presented. And you're definitely showing a vision of where we're headed. I think the thing I'm struggling with, and I think maybe Seth put some chat in too, is the transition. You know, how we get there over the next, like, what coding direction do we come to as a community to try to standardize data collection over, I'm saying kind of the shorter term, which 2 to 4 years maybe, until that tool becomes much more accessible. But I know we're only down to 4 minutes, so I'm kind of wondering if there's anybody else on the call that wants to say anything at this point. Any reactions? I also wonder if this is an IGRI conference. Maybe we should continue this in the IGRI conference. Does anybody else have anything, Juniper?
Yeah, I was just in response to your question, Charlie, about kind of the pros and cons of the continued path. I think one of the challenges for many of us who've used IG 1.0 is kind of translating what we get out of that into something meaningful, right? And so I guess I don't have an answer to this question, but I guess my question is, if we continue to pursue kind of distribution of the 1.0, are we solving some of the challenges that the use of institutional grammar has had as kind of a method for revealing things that we care about and are interested in? So that's kind of what I'm going to be pondering as we think about how to move forward with the method overall.
Go ahead, Christopher.
Just my response, in a way twofold. Charlie, I see your point. I recognize your point. Well, but there is an element of path dependence you need to bear in mind. Up to date, literally all people using the institutional grammar have been trained on Excel sheets. It was the mode of training. There was no other way of thinking about it. I mean, it's not even a different pathway conceivable. I think by introducing to training, we can, in practice see how far coding, for example, IG script or whatever other dialect of that would actually foster or be more productive in terms of generating, the output that people may need for their analytical purposes. So I think that's not so much a discussion, only because you see how to use it at face value would mean that it's the obvious way to go. But if you had been trained to use a different tool, I think that would be equally accessible. So my argument for this is training and try it out. If people really say no, Excel is easier, then that's the way to go. I mean, because we all have our, we are primed in one way or another, I think.
I think this is I really appreciate this discussion, and I hope, this will keep moving us forward in terms of discussions about what's going to be our open data standards, because I think that's just really important for our community. So right now we better close it out. We've got 2 minutes left. So just a few closing comments. So we're combining the IG 1.0 data sets to provide IG extract training data. So, and we'd like to put the spreadsheet data structure, up, or maybe we need to have some more discussions. I think maybe we're at a point where we need to have some more discussions about this. So maybe it's not time to do that, but we would ask that you please share your coded data so that we can use it as training data for the IG extract machine learning. We had a nice participation from the survey, but if anybody has data that they could share, we'd appreciate receiving it. So are there any kind of last comments? And I would like to know what people think about having a session devoted to this, just talking about, I think Seth's point about meeting people where they are right now, but Chris's point about, they've been trained in Excel. So if we start training them with a new tool, then that's going to become what they're used to using. And so we do have a ways to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, one of from my perspective, one of the problems we're talking about is that IG coding is relational. There's one-to-many relationships are in it, and spreadsheets are meant for that. But Christopher, you know, you sent us at one point an IG 2.0 spreadsheet. I totally get your point about let's move away from spreadsheets, that point I just made. But you had something that was a spreadsheet version of this where you had codes, and maybe that's a transition point. Anyway, I think we should have a conversation in the IGRI conference on this and make space for it. Saba's given a thumbs up. And well, I'll just say thank you to Santiago, who did a lot of hard work on the survey and putting this stuff together. And yeah, and thank you all for listening to us and participating in this conversation.
Thank you all.